we are deploying all the assets that we can, working with all the coalition allies that we can to identify their locations. Obviously, this is something that is heartbreaking for families, and our obligation is to make sure that we can do anything we can to try to make sure that any American citizen is rescued from this situation.
Alongside Miranda Kahn, J.D. Hayworth back with you on America's Forum. We just heard from President Obama in an interview with NBC News' Savannah Guthrie that appeared earlier this morning on the Today Show. A little different from the interview yesterday live from the White House kitchen. I'll be talking more about that in the way I see it later this hour. But in the interview this morning, the president fairly straightforward talking about trying to bring back home an American hostage.
Yes. Obviously, the hostage is a 26-year-old American woman who, as you may recall, was kidnapped a year ago in Syria while doing humanitarian work.
And the problem is obviously vexing for the White House because just a week ago, in the wake of the exchange of Bo Bergdahl, who we believe may be brought up on desertion charges, at least that is the assertion from some with great knowledge of what goes on in the Pentagon. You had Bo Bergdahl brought home in exchange for the Taliban five terrorists, one of whom got on the phone last week from, I believe, from Qatar, and recontacted some terror elements apparently wanting to get back into business. So you had this almost absurd distinction from the White House saying, oh, we don't negotiate with terrorists, and suddenly the Taliban, not a terrorist group, but an armed insurgency. You know, it's time for a little straight talk on all of this, and that's why we're very happy to bring in Robert Grenier, the former CIA station chief for Pakistan and the former director of the CIA's Counterterrorism series. Mr. Grenier is the author of the book 88 Days to Kandahar, a CIA diary. Robert, we very much appreciate your time as you Skype in with us this morning.
Well, thank you very much for having me.
So we heard the president in that interview aired earlier this morning on the Today Show on NBC saying when it comes to getting back this American woman, we are, quote, deploying all assets. What does that entail?
Well, I'm not exactly sure I'm familiar with the story. So this is an American woman who is being held where?
I believe she's being held in Syria.
Mm-hmm.
Ah. Well, we do have some capabilities in that region, as you know. As you know, we have military airstrikes that are taking place essentially as we speak, and we do have a number of bases in the region. I think our basing rights in Turkey right now are a bit problematic, but we do have bases elsewhere in the region, and I think that the critical issue here is going to be real-time intelligence that would enable them to determine precisely where she is at a given point in time and give them enough time to actually launch an operation, if in fact that is what's being considered.
Robert, as a former CIA station chief for Pakistan, how concerned are you about that particular region? We had someone basically telling us last week not to trust Pakistan at all, that Pakistan really isn't the true ally that we think it is.
Well, Pakistan has always been a very problematic ally. There are certain areas where we have common interests that we've been able to pursue jointly, dating back, in fact, before the so-called anti-Soviet jihad of the 1980s, when the Pakistanis were very helpful in working with us and driving the Soviets out of Afghanistan. They also played a major role with us much earlier than that in providing us support during the Cold War with the Soviet Union. So there's a long story there. But that said, they have their own view of their national interest, and we have tended to part ways, particularly with regard to the Afghan Taliban. And so while we cooperate very closely in some areas, there have always been very problematic parts of our relationship as well.
Robert, I want to get your overview. As we were bringing you on camera, we were discussing the apparent contradiction from our White House, on one hand saying, oh, we don't negotiate with terrorists, and going so far as to say, oh, the Taliban, it's not a terror group, it's an armed insurgency. We have conducted swaps, whatever you want to call them, Bo Bergdahl for the Taliban 5, rather than a military operation. Do you believe the White House might be more inclined to make another prisoner exchange to get back the woman in Syria?
Well, I think that the situation with the woman in Syria would be far more problematic. Whatever ambiguities that there might be in the status or the category that we want to put the Afghan Taliban in, there's no ambiguity with regard to ISIS. That is clearly an international terrorist group. This is a civilian. This would not be a prisoner of war exchange. It could certainly not be presented in that way. And we have had a very firm national policy, which dates back decades now, not to negotiate with terrorists when they take American hostages, simply because that further incentivizes them to try to seize more American hostages.
Well, we brought up the Taliban, and we've talked about Pakistan and now Afghanistan, which is really what your book talks about. It's a true story of America's first war in Afghanistan. Tell us a little bit about it and what inspired you to write it.
Well, I was the CIA station chief in Islamabad, Pakistan, when 9/11 occurred, and at that time I had responsibility for all covert U.S. intelligence collection, not only in Pakistan, but also in all of Taliban-controlled Afghanistan, which was about 90% of the country at the time. And suddenly, with 9/11, my job was no longer just to report on what was happening in Afghanistan and to try to track Osama bin Laden and al-Qaeda. I had to do something about it. And I was asked by George Tenet to make recommendations as to what we should do. I had the opportunity to do that. The war plan that I prepared in September of 2001 was adopted by President Bush, and that was the original template for our military effort in Afghanistan. And so this book, I wrote it essentially as an adventure story, if you will, at its heart. It's the story of the 88 days from 9/11 until we succeeded in driving al-Qaeda and the Taliban out of its capital in Kandahar in southern Afghanistan.
Robert Grenier, the former CIA station chief in Pakistan, as he mentioned there in Islamabad, also the former director of the CIA Counterterrorism Center. The name of his book again, 88 Days to Kandahar, a CIA diary. Robert, we thank you very much for your time and your perspective. And there are those who say that in the early days post 9/11, what we did in Afghanistan in terms of using special forces, using our intelligence assets and our air power, perhaps we should adopt a back to the future strategy like that. Not such a huge footprint with infrastructure and the presence of American troops, but the flexibility that Robert Grenier advocated and endorsed, and you can read more about it in his book. When we continue here, it's time, I know in the military it's left, right, forward, march, but with us it's left versus right to discuss the issues. Javier Manhattas on the right, Ari Rabenhoff on the left, following this update.